Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I grew up in the 50s, possibly a long time before some of you may have ever been born. I was raised in a small town where everybody knew each other. Where we lived was very rural and rustic, and the population was not big at all. My father built the home where we lived from scratch, as he came from a family of master builders, and he even went to England to learn stone masonry, so he knew how to put stones together on top of each other to make stone walls without any cement or fillers, which takes remarkable skill and is not easily learnt. The house he built was a masterpiece for the 50s, which he transformed into a 2-storey red brick federal-style home, where he incorporated stone walls into the architecture and introduced the most wonderful stone fireplaces in all the main rooms, including large sash windows throughout that overlooked the most ravishing panoramic views of the undulating verdant countryside where we lived. We had several horses on our land and raised chickens and pigs. My father built a quaint stone wall around our property, and many people paid him good money to do the same for him, because our wall was greatly admired by all the locals in our area. As in the heart of the English countryside, you can find many of these quaint stone walls built with perfection, one stone upon another, and all of them are stunning. Growing up as a young girl, I'd heard that there was a hermit that lived on the hill, and everybody knew about him. He lived in a tiny shack that was made up of a few panels of wood, and was so small it was almost as tiny as a yard shed. The man lived off the land, and he really was a wild man, but it was said that this hermit was wise, and some had sought him out for advice when they were facing challenges in their lives. My mother told me once that a great friend of hers, who was facing a huge quandary in her turbulent, tumultuous relationship, had ultimately reached a place of helpless, crippling despair in her life. She didn't want to file for divorce, so in her feeble desperation she'd visited the hermit for advice. Since her consultation with the elusive, evasive wild man, equivalent to a modern-day John the Baptist, her marriage was miraculously transformed, and everybody noticed that her relationship with her husband had become exceptionally happy, and she was so radiant. How was that even possible, the people had wondered in awe. How could something be fixed that had been irredeemably broken? For they were always the couple in the town with the tempestuous, fiery relationship that people actually took wagers on in believing it would fail, because they were an incongruous, unsuitable pair at the very best of times, but suddenly it would seem they had become the perfect match. "Wow," I said. "Did she tell you what the hermit told her?" "Of course not," said my mother. "You can never share the secret." Then there was a man who'd lost his leg in an accident, and he was so depressed because he could not play soccer anymore, so he also visited the hermit. "What happened?" I asked. "Well, after he visited the hermit, he became a PE instructor at a local school, and he never looked back and was always happy. Then there was the time when a woman was told she couldn't have children, and she felt her life had no purpose, and after seeing the hermit, she actually adopted 2 children." "It sounds to me as if the hermit was just giving good practical sound advice," I said. "Oh, but it was much more than that," said my mother. "These people physically, mentally and emotionally changed after their visit with him. They were just so radiant. It exuded from every pore of their bodies. It's hard to explain. It was so miraculous, their transformation. Well then, why doesn't he set up shop as a therapist, I said sarcastically, so that everybody can see him? Because, darling, my mother said, he's a wild man that is one with the natural world. He lives off the land, sleeps under the stars, and knows all the animals. You cannot just visit him willy-nilly. No one can. Why not, I asked. Because he will always turn people away, unless their energy field is of a turquoise hue. What does colour have to do with energy field, I asked. Apparently we all have frequencies known as vibrations, my mother told me. Everyone has their own energy signature, just like plants, animals, humans, and even colours. Someone who is desperate enough to find the answers in life and is actively seeking, they have an energy frequency of the colour turquoise. Only then will the hermit see you. I imagine he must read frequencies on people. I gather Tesla said that you understand the universe when you understand energy, frequency, and vibration. For many long years as a young child, I tried my level best to get a look at this hermit on the hill, but he was very elusive and evasive, and almost impossible to find. He lived on the largest hill out of the 3 smaller ones in the northern valley, and at the bottom of the hill was a large lake, and on the right-hand side of the lake was a dense forest that stretched back for many long miles. The locals in the area never visited that forest, possibly because of the distinct probability of running into the hermit. Many were intimidated and afraid of encountering the man, because some believed that he could see right through their soul, and that was unsettling and discomposing for most. Some were afraid of him because they thought he was some kind of a wizard that may dabble in the black arts, but anyone who had ever visited him described him as a man of God who was one with the natural world. Even though some of the locals feared the hermit or wild man, I was very curious and intrigued by him, and also determined to seek him out. I knew the hermit would never ever talk to me, because I doubted that my energy field possessed a turquoise hue. But I desperately wanted to see this man for myself, and there was a deep, unexplainable longing and yearning in my heart to encounter him, of which was unfathomable. One day in early spring, when the winter months had all but receded, and the snow had melted away, to be replaced by the glorious rays of sunshine that filtered over the verdant valley. After a long, arduous, cold winter, it was a welcome relief. I was bedazzled and beguiled by the hilly countryside that was carpeted with pretty white spring flowers, and I watched in awe as colourful butterflies literally darted from one flower to another. It really did feel like spring. I knew in my heart that this was the quintessential perfect day to search for the hermit. Why I felt this way, I did not know. I walked down the long, narrow, uneven dirt road that was covered in rocky pebbles, until I finally reached a very pronounced fork at the end of the road, and turned to my right. I continued ambling along this precariously rugged path, until I came to a large clearing where there was a silvery lake, fringed by a very sizable hill, which was reflected upon its gleaming watery surface. It was common knowledge that this was where the hermit lived. I walked past the small lake, and climbed up the steep verdant hill that was speckled with yellow spring flowers. Finally I came upon the dilapidated shack that was falling apart at the seams. I peered inside, and the place was tiny, rudimentary and basic as you can get. There were animal skins scattered upon the floor, a large boulder used as a makeshift chair, and a huge gathering of stones covered with a long shelf that was clearly used as a table. There was a metal plate, spoon and bowl, and a couple of large pots, possibly used for cooking, a selection of sharp knives, and there was a glass container filled with salt, and that was how basic and Spartan this place actually was. I was surprised to see no matches, torches, spades or rifles in the shack. Surely if you lived off the land, you needed fire starters, torchlights and rifles, but this man had none of these essential basics. It was decidedly odd as far as I was concerned, but these mysteries intrigued me all the more about this curious man, and I was not going to give up on my search to find him. It then occurred to me that the hermit could be in the Sylvan, and so I decided to seek him out with dogged determination. Surely he was there, as where else could he possibly be? Bear in mind I had not been into the woods before, and it wasn't used by any of the locals. I truly did not know what on earth I would find in those woods, but my eagerness to encounter the hermit overcame my reluctance and uncertainty. As I ventured into this exquisite shaded wooded oasis full of statuesque mature oaks and spruce trees with branches covered in resplendent veils of emerald green moss, I noted that pretty prisms of light danced through the branches, dappling the floor in an ethereal light, which created a magical tranquil ambience. There were yellow spring daffodils and open frilly ferns sweeping across the ground. One thing struck me straight away, and that was how open the forest appeared, as there were perfect dirt trails everywhere. It was as if someone had cleared away a lot of the dense undergrowth, thinning it out and removing the less necessary small saplings that so often steal the space. I wondered if all this open space was in fact the work of the hermit. I thought it lightly. I knew that this place was special, with an enchanting energy, serenaded by the joyful chorus of pretty birdsong. I encountered some white-tailed deer, looking at me rather curiously. They didn't even run away, which was surprising, as these gentle creatures are usually very skittish, but not these ones. As I ventured boldly into the forest, I could see no sight or sound of the hermit, and I was beginning to feel bitterly disappointed. Maybe he wasn't here after all. I was just about to turn around when I heard this whistling sound. It was incredibly pretty, almost bird-like, but I knew it had to belong to the hermit. I could feel my heart fluttering in excitement, and I crept towards the sound because I wanted the hermit to see me and not to turn me away. As I approached the whistler, I realised that the person that was whistling was not a person at all, but a colossal wild man with ape-like influences, covered in long flowing silvery hair, and he was about 7 foot tall and 600 pounds. I think the thing that staggered me the most was the gargantuan size of this thing. It boggled my mind. I know I should have been terrified, but shock has the extraordinary capacity to suppress and almost hijack your fear, especially when something you encounter defies all rational explanation. It is possible I was not certain how to react, for I couldn't fathom what I was discerning. The critter had a distinct V-shaped torso, typically seen in conditioned high-performance athletes, as indeed every part of his sinewy body rippled with muscle definition and tone. I noted that his vast shoulders easily exceeded 3 feet in width, while his legs were short and powerful, and his arms exceedingly long, like that of a primate. The creature possessed a dome-shaped head that folded into the shoulders in a flowing sweep. I could not discern any evidence of a neck. The grey leathery face was the texture and colour of a rhino hide, with a prominent wrinkled brow ridge, flat nose, and deep-set dark brown eyes. Upon discerning my appearance, the unguarded critter appeared astonished. I imagine he did not have to be elusive in this wood-green, because seeing humans in there was exceedingly unlikely to ever happen, because no one ever visited the area. The critter was unprepared for our random encounter, and he didn't know how to react to me, any more than I knew how to react to him. For a long while we just stared at each other, locked in a powerful gaze that seemed almost hypnotic, as both of us became like stone statues, frozen in time. It was like being face to face with an apex predator that potentially could kill you in a heartbeat. Should I run, I wondered, or should I stand my ground? I really cannot explain how I felt, because I don't even think I knew. I think I was more muddled and confused because I hadn't expected to see a wild ape man in the forests of North America. I didn't even know that such creatures existed. I did something extraordinarily crazy. I looked directly at the creature and spoke to him as if he was human. "I'm so sorry to bother you," I said. "I was looking for the hermit on the hill, and when I heard you whistle, I thought you must be him." The creature looked at me, and his forehead contorted into wrinkles, as though puzzled, but I think he knew I was trying to communicate with him. Suddenly I heard a man's deep voice saying, "That would be me. I'm the hermit." As the man stepped forward, the humanoid ape seemed to visibly relax, and the hermit spoke to him in a chattering sound, and I listened to this hermit talking to the creature in what I can only describe as a monkey language. They kept talking together, backwards and forwards. It was utterly extraordinary. I'd never seen a human who could talk to animals before, like this man could. My mother was right. This celestial man knew the animals and was one with the natural world. But there was something about his radiant ambrosial countenance that was also angelic and outer-worldly. I always remember that I often wondered if he was, in fact, an angel. "What was he saying to you?" I asked the hermit, as the strange humanoid critter nodded at me and finally glided away with a seamless grace. "He was saying you're out of place in the woods and do not belong here. He did not know what you were doing here and was concerned about you." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that you are on a quest to find me." The hermit was a man with a whiter-than-white hair and a long white beard that was 17 inches long. He had a sun-kissed, rugged face and the brightest, most beautiful blue eyes that I've ever seen. They were like pools of the most glorious blue water. He was wearing an animal skin around his middle, and his torso was bare, and his body was lean, ripped and muscular. "What is it I can do for you, young lady?" he asked. I stood there awkwardly, suddenly feeling very foolish, because I'd been seeking the hermit all my young life because of a curious, intriguing fascination for him, but I'd never really needed to ask him anything at all, and now I felt rather silly. What was it I wanted with him? I didn't even know the answer myself to that daunting, sophisticated question. "I don't know," I said. "I just wanted to see you, but I don't really know why." "If you're seeking me, you must have a reason. No one searches without finding what they're looking for. If you are searching, you are looking, and if you look hard enough, you will find what you are looking for. No one searches for no reason. There is a reason behind every action. The question is, what is your reason?" "I just wanted to see what you look like, I guess," I said. The hermit started to laugh at me. "How comical," he said. "That's what you told yourself when you were looking for me. But search within your heart, because the answer is written in there. My mother says you won't see anyone unless they have a turquoise auric field." "Your mother is right about that. But you, my dear, have a turquoise aura, for you are indeed a truth-seeker. Now search your heart. What are you looking for?" I suppose I just want to know my purpose," I said. "Why am I here?" "You think your life is accidental," laughed the hermit. "No life is an accident. Everything here, from a butterfly to a person, is meant to be. Everything is planned and mapped out. There are no accidents." "What about bad things that happen? Are they meant to be?" I asked. "Bad things are the opposite to good things. You cannot know good without experiencing bad. You cannot know sweet without experiencing and tasting sour." "You mean we need to experience it all?" I asked. "It's called the rich tapestry of life, but you have the power to control that thread with your thoughts. If you choose happy, positive thoughts, you draw in a very powerful, strong vibration. And that means that good things are naturally drawn into your life. Like attracts like. If you are negative, fearful, angry and unkind, you weave a very low vibrational path for yourself, and you reap the fruits of those thoughts in your life. Thoughts can be like daggers. They can hurt and ensnare, and they can heal and restore." "You mean we are what we actually think, and the thread that we weave is our thoughts?" "Precisely," said the hermit. "That's exactly right." After my experience with the hermit on the hill, my life changed dramatically, and people complimented me on my radiance. Something within my psyche shifted, and I chose to weave the tapestry of my life with positive, happy thoughts, and to treat others always with kindness. From that moment on, I chose to see the positive in every situation, and truly it transformed and revitalized my life in ways you could never imagine possible. All these years later, my life has been blessed with vibrant health, financial prosperity, and abundant joy, as I always guard my thoughts. And it is so attainable for all of us if we let go of our fears, anxieties, judgmental thoughts, and condemnation, and embrace the freedom of letting go, learning to trust, and embracing love. For the Hermit showed me that if we raise our vibrations, we completely elevate and transform our lives. I was to discover the hairy ape-like humanoid that I encountered that day in the forest was a Bigfoot, and I learnt a lot about the creature from my research, and realised how exceedingly privileged I was to encounter this hairy humanoid, and it was incredible that the Hermit on the hill could literally speak in his language, but there were a lot of things about that Hermit on the hill that defied natural explanation. I know my story sounds crazy and implausible, but I promise you it's true, and whether you believe it or not is not significant to me, but it has been a total pleasure sharing it with you and your listeners. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Cole, and I'm from a North American rural town where I'd like to keep the details as vague and obscure as possible for the benefits of remaining anonymous. I'm now in my 80s, sporting a full head of white hair and a rather slender frame, as unfortunately the ageing process has withered away my very muscular physique that I boasted in my former younger years. Yet I'm exceedingly blessed to be vigorous and robust and in good sound health, with a very sharp mind and crystal clear memory. I grew up in a very rustic Arcadian rough and tumble wooden cabin with 3 sisters and 4 brothers, and life was exceedingly tough and demanding for us, as my family were exceptionally poor. We grew our own vegetables in the backyard, and my father was a keen fisherman and an excellent trapper, so we did manage to enjoy a varied diet, complemented by a few odds and ends from the local store, like rice, flour, sugar and beans. In those days the elders ate first, and the kids would eat the leftovers, as that is what it was like back then. Our cabin was very bucolic, primitive and peasant-like. We did not have running water or electricity for a long time, and the family shared 2 queen-size beds that my dad fortunately found at a dumpster that were in relatively good nick. I remember we pretty much wore the same clothes every day until we finally wore them out, and my mother had to buy new clothes at a thrift store for us. As a younger brother, I would share a single pair of shoes, as most of the time we'd run around the countryside in our bare feet. I think growing up I never appreciated how poor we actually were, because we didn't know any better at the time. We assumed that everybody else lived life as sparingly as we did. One thing I do remember was that life was good, because the natural world was our quintessential playground, and we were surrounded by dreamy forests, verdant hilly valleys, and as kids we loved it all. We would swim in the lake and play hide-and-seek in the woods. We would explore the caves and watch the wild animals. Whenever possible, we rescued orphaned animals like baby raccoons and fawns and nursed them back to health until they were strong enough to be released into the wild. It was something we all naturally did back then. From a very young age, I fancied myself becoming a sheriff one day, and I emphatically believed with a clad iron faith that this would invariably happen, and my dream would ultimately be realised. Fast forward to when I was 25, I had become a deputy sheriff in our local town, which was a huge deal for my family. I had managed to elevate my lifestyle considerably, leaving behind the financial struggles and woes of my early life. Even my parents managed to step up their standard of living, as my father procured a favourable job in the town, so things took a turn for the better, as far as my family was concerned. At that time I was very happily married to my wife Ruth, with 1 bun in the oven, or should I say kid on the way. I was working with the local sheriff, who had recently been suffering from heart palpitations, and so I began to handle the lion's share of the work, which included most of the call-outs we received from the locals in our area. One day a woman phoned me up frantically to tell me that she'd seen an ape-like humanoid sitting in her pond eating frogs, and she was absolutely terrified because she described the creature as huge. I quickly arrived at her home and was more than a little cynical, secretly wondering if she might have been inebriated, drunk and intoxicated from drinking way too much moonshine. Unfortunately, this was a predominant problem in our neck of the woods. "You don't believe me, do you, Sheriff?" she said, looking at me with round, scared eyes. "You think I've been drinking, don't you? But I know what I saw, and whatever it was colossal. It was covered with dark, flowing hair. It was terrifying." "Ma'am," I said, "I do have to ask you, have you been drinking or taking any hallucinatory drugs?" "I told you I haven't been drinking. I haven't at all," she assured me. "Sheriff, I need you to believe me. I need you to trust me on this, because what if that monster comes back? It could harm me." I did detect the abashed woman was exceedingly rattled, so I knew I needed to take her seriously, but her preposterous, absurd claims seemed so farcical and implausible. I went through the ritualistic motions of taking her uncompelling account seriously. I proceeded to investigate the muddy area around her pond, and to my astonishment, I discovered a 20-inch footprint in the ground. For a second I stood still, hardly daring to believe what I was perceiving, as I knew that this was no bear footprint. I am familiar with bears. It was clear that the woman had seen something, and my countenance changed, and I was less dismissive of her outlandish claims, and more inclined to believe her strange report, however crazy it might seem. "If you see the creature again, give me a call at once," I told her, "and I'll be right over." The woman looked heartily relieved. "You believe me, Sheriff? I do believe you saw something. But what you saw, madam, I have no idea." "I'm glad to inform you that the mysterious critter never came back to her pond, I'm relieved to say, because that woman never called me out again. And believe me, if it had returned, she would have. One day I received another alarmed call. This time it was from a local, very distressed farmer called Bob, who claimed that his beloved wife Gemma had mysteriously gone missing after berry picking and was nowhere to be found. "Sheriff," he said, "she's vanished into thin air. I found her mixed basket of huckleberries and blackberries lying on the ground next to the bush, but she was nowhere to be seen. I know something quite terrible has happened to her. Maybe she was mauled by a mountain lion. I really believe the worst has happened." "Calm down," I told him. "I won't rest until we find her, and that's a promise." As you can imagine, we launched a full-scale search for poor Gemma, with many local volunteers helping in the hunt, but only her sweater was recovered. We discovered it was covered in what we believed at the time to be bloodstains, which meant everybody automatically assumed the worst. We all believed we were searching for a dead body. Later we determined that these were stains from berry juices. No one had any idea where on earth Gemma had gone. As you can imagine, Bob was so broken-hearted and devastated about the disappearance of his wife, always fearing the worst. After about 3 days, the missing farmer's wife suddenly returned to her farm, looking bedraggled and dirty, but no worse for wear. And she had quite a story to tell me, that she only ever shared with her husband and myself. No one else ever knew the true account of what actually happened to her over the course of those tumultuous 3 days that left everyone in the community on tender hooks, so to speak. So this was her story, in her own words, as she told it to me. "Sheriff, for many weeks now," she told me, "I felt as if something was watching me. I would be hanging out my washing on the line and would sense something was there, but I would see absolutely nothing. Our washing line is flanked by a large sylvan that was only 50 feet away, so anything could have potentially been there, and I probably wouldn't have seen it. I thought I was going stark raving mad, because one day in my bedroom I could swear I'd seen a large face staring at me pressed against the glass pane, but that idea was implausible, as my window is at least 8 feet off the ground. It would have been physically impossible for someone to stare at me without the use of a ladder. I thought I had to be seeing things because it happens so fast. It's easy to believe your imagination is playing tricks on you when things happen at a very vast speed. It's rather like seeing a dark shadow in your peripheral vision, but when you turn around to look, nothing is there, so you believe that it was all a trick of the light or something. Did you tell your husband about these strange feelings of yours? No, of course not. Bob has a great deal to do around the farm. I hardly wanted to concern him with those erroneous claims that I couldn't even substantiate myself. You see, Sheriff, Bob and I are very practical, down-to-earth people that are not inclined to fanciful thinking of any kind. Go on, I said. I need to hear the story. Well, one day I told Bob I was going to do some berry picking, as I wanted to make a batch of homemade mixed berry jams, and there was an abundance of huckleberries and blackberries growing wild. I gathered my basket and proceeded along my way, and began to pick the berries, when suddenly I got the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up and saw this dark, shadowy figure lunging towards me, and at first I thought it was a bear. I was so stunned I couldn't even run away. I just froze to the spot like an ice statue. I do recall that my heart was pounding vigorously in my chest, rather like a heavy drum. I've never known fear like that, Sheriff. It completely paralysed and incapacitated me, and I had absolutely no ability to even cry out or scream for help. Believe me, I wanted to with all my heart and might, but even my tongue was tied. The big critter hauled me over his shoulders, rather like a sack of big potatoes, and ran through the sylvan, holding me down with his powerful arms and strong human-like hands. I really believed I was his next meal, and I was terrified. I saw my life flashing before me, Sheriff, and I began to cry. I promise you, this agile, graceful critter could run like the wind. I've never seen anything like it. He glided up this mountainous ridge with the agility of a mountain goat and the speed of a cheetah, without even bumping or jarring in any way. Before long I found myself being lowered onto the earthen floor of a large, very cool cave. The critter closed the mouth of the cave with a large boulder so that I couldn't escape. The earthen floor was covered in bear pelts and other animal skins, and there were farmers' bales of straw that had been made into long beds, covered in pelts. He beckoned for me to sit on one of those beds, which I did, and it was surprisingly comfortable. It was then that I realised I wasn't alone in that cave, and there was a female with her male youngling in the cave too. I could tell she was aggrieved and piqued to see me, and I sensed she was begrudgingly jealous, as if in some way she saw me as stiff competition for her. What did they look like? I asked. Well, the one that abducted me was Herculean in size. I believe he'd been spying on me for a long time. It must have been him that was looking at me through the window. He fully intended to abduct me. I'm sure of that. I think he was infatuated and smitten by me. I would say he was human-like with ape-like influences, in my opinion. He looked like a wild man, with human hazel-like hair that covered his body. He was exceedingly well built, and bigger than a grizzly bear, and wider than my front door. I know he must have been about 8 foot tall, with overlong arms so typical of primates, and very short, powerful, stocky legs, with human-like hands and feet. His head was shaped like a pyramid, and just sat on the shoulders, as there was no neck on him at all. For his species, I think he would have been regarded as quite handsome. And his face, what was that like? I asked. Well, they all had human-like leathery faces that were olive in their skin tone, but with furrowed brow ridges, flat noses and thin mouths, and deep-set brown eyes. When did you realise the critter didn't want to eat you? I asked. Well, he was gentle and kind towards me, and seemed very concerned about my comfort and well-being. I was astonished, Sheriff, because this creature prepared a fire in the middle of the cave, and he did it with such effortless ease in his hands, rubbing 2 pieces of wood together to create friction. Humans struggled to do that, but he didn't. I noted there were ventilation holes in the roof of the cave. The cave was cool, and the fire was warming. The critter cooked me some pieces of meat from a deer carcass, which he put on a wooden skewer and handed directly to me. I noted that they preferred to eat their meat raw, but he knew exactly how humans ate, and he catered for my very needs. And there was also a pitcher of water in the cave as well. He was intent on pleasing me in every way, and I could tell the fuss he was making over me was incredibly unsettling for the female, who looked like a woman who'd been ditched by her partner and wasn't happy about it at all. I would describe her as sulking in the corner of the cave, watching me with wide, earnest eyes. She even tried to mimic my movements to get the male's attention, but he never noticed her at all. He kept just staring at me with besotted, wide, adoring eyes, as if I was the most beguiling, fetching, beautiful thing that he'd ever seen in his entire life. He was fixated and enamoured by me, like you might be over a great work of art hanging on your wall. On one occasion he came up to me and actually touched my skin with such awe, and he would make this "ooh" sound, as if he was so impressed and bedazzled by my hairless skin. And the little one, how did it react to you? It was fascinated and curious by me, and terribly, terribly cute, I might add, just like any child that's curious. He always wanted to play and tried to engage in all kinds of games with me, using pine cones, acorns, pebbles, animal teeth and stuff like that. Before long I got the hang of some of those games, and I enjoyed playing with the little one, as he was as bright as a button and very clever. How did these creatures communicate? I asked. Well, they're very intelligent. I can assure you of that, Sheriff. They possess human-like emotions and are poignantly expressive. They also use their body language, reenactments and hand gestures to complement their speech. The animated language sounds like a lively, high-pitched monkey chatter, but the words that are spoken are usually fast and earnest, and the creatures are very garrulous. They talk a lot, backwards and forwards all the time to each other. You can tell by their auditory tone whether they're cross or happy, like you can with a human being. If they raise their pitch very high, they may be overexcited, or possibly exceedingly angry. But a medium pitch is conversational. Did the female communicate with you at all? No, not at first. She was reticent, self-effacing and very evasive, but she did begin to rant and rave at the male to express her extreme indignation for bringing me into the cave. At first she threw pine cones at him in her rage, and the little youngling began to join in, thinking it was all a wonderful, exciting game. He really enjoyed throwing stuff at his father and was chattering away happily. It was like the cave had become hit with an avalanche of pine cones. The female did not treat the male nicely at all while I was there, because she was not at all happy with my presence. I can't say I blame her. I remember she definitely threw a squirrel carcass for him to eat, but he didn't seem to care about her insolent tantrums and just chose to ignore her. I think he was an easy-going critter, not predisposed to losing his temper or getting flustered or upset easily. All the critters had very different personalities, and the male was actually rather a benign, benevolent and quite a likeable fellow, which sounds incongruous to describe an abductor like that, but he was. I think he was a headstrong fellow that literally went after what he wanted and decided he wanted me, and it was as simple as that. Did you manage to sleep in that cave comfortably? I asked. Quite easily, actually. Funny enough, it was more cosy than a tent with a sleeping bag. I did sleep incredibly well, but I was so desperate to escape, as I wanted to return to Bob. But with the stone blocking the entrance to the cave, there was no chance of running away, as the male was so determined to keep me as a possession, like a work of art that you want to admire, or like a prize pet that you love. I have to say that he never made any amorous advances towards me, which was a monumental relief as far as I was concerned. I didn't realise just how eager the female was to actually see the back of me, and so one day after the male had gone off with the youngling, the female rolled back the stone and indicated for me to follow her. I remember, Sheriff, my heart was literally doing flip-flops. I was so excited. But when I looked out of the cave, I was bitterly disappointed. I knew it was physically impossible and daunting for me to escape. It was treacherous terrain out there. The female was encouraging me to leave, as if she assumed I was capable of accessing that steep, rugged terrain on my own. Finally, she seemed to realise my plight, and reluctantly she threw me over her shoulders and ran down the steep rocky elevation with me on her back. She headed towards the nearest human habitation, and that was how I managed to escape. As you can imagine, Bob was so pleased to have his wife back, and he sent her to stay with his sister, who lived further afield, while he sold up his farm and bought another farm further away. He was very concerned his wife would be abducted again by the fixated critter, and his wife did not want him to kill him, because she said that they were so human-like. I knew the woman's account was indeed truthful, but she begged me not to tell anyone what had happened to her, and to say that she had got lost in the woods after sustaining a blow to her head, and subsequently becoming confused and disorientated until I found her. I reluctantly agreed to this request because, quite frankly, I didn't like the idea of filing such an erroneous and credulous account on my police report that might ultimately undermine my credibility as sheriff. Over my years of being a deputy sheriff and finally becoming a sheriff, I did receive many reports of erroneous encounters with these hairy men of the woods. Most of the encounters were benign, although the witnesses in these cases were terrified and unnerved by the encounter, given the size of the critter, while others were intrigued. They were even excited and enthralled by what they'd observed, and longed for another sighting of the creature. Another case I vividly remember was when a young man told me in the strictest of confidence that his father had been attacked and killed by a very dangerous beast during a hunt that most certainly wasn't a bear. This was the story he shared with me, on the strict condition that it remained a secret knowledge between just the two of us. But now, with all these years gone by, I don't think he'll mind me sharing his story, as long as he remains anonymous. Well, my dad and I decided to go squirrel hunting, but when we entered the woods, something didn't feel right, he told me. I can't explain it, but I really had a chill running down my spine, and my hair was standing on edge. The forest that is normally alive with birdsong was deathly quiet, so much so that you could hear a pin drop, and there was an unpleasant smell lingering in the air that rather reminded me of a dead animal, that kept perforating my nostrils and burning my eyes. I also had this disturbing, unsettling feeling that we weren't alone and that something was stalking us. My father had no sense of smell at the time, so he never discerned anything at all, and when I expressed my misgivings and suggested that we should call it a day, my dad thought I was overreacting. He never scares easily, and is impulsive and headstrong at the very best of times, and so that I knew persuading him to abandon our hunt was not going to wash well with him at all. After we'd taken down a couple of squirrels, I began to feel this terrible anxiety. I really sensed we were in terrible danger, and that was when we heard the sounds of something bipedal, very, very heavy and powerful, moving towards us in the brush, that sounded rather like a rhino in the thicket. My father wanted to scare it off, and fired a round of shots, hoping to frighten it away, but I think that may have been his greatest undoing. The next thing I knew was we heard this almighty scream that was so terrifying I began to hyperventilate, and I ran to a tree to calm myself down and take some slow breaths, while my father was shouting, "Run, son, run!" But I just couldn't run. I was incapacitated by fear, so I just hid behind the tree. The next thing I know is this monstrous black critter came charging through the undergrowth like a steam train on full throttle, and he pounced upon my father. "What did this critter look like?" I asked. "Blacker than a raven, sir. The darkest long shaggy hair that you've ever seen, and the meanest looking face. It had a cone-shaped head and body that was so massive that he was built like an army tank. The only way to describe him was that he had the look of an ape and a man merged together. I've no idea what he was, but if you told me that he emerged from the pit of hell, I would have believed you, sir." The critter pounced on my dad, holding him on the ground and straddling him under his very powerful buttocks over his lung area, which immediately suffocated and crushed him within a second or so. When the critter let go of my dad, he seemed genuinely surprised and disappointed that my dad was dead. It was as if he was trying to teach him a lesson. I doubt he even knew the power of his monstrous weight, so I'm not sure if he actually intended to kill my dad or not, but I do know that he was furious at being shot at. Things might have ended differently if my father hadn't challenged him in the way that he did by shooting at the critter. It was the worst thing he could have possibly done. So these were the strange stories that I have to share with you of unusual encounters the locals had in my area with the critter that I now know to be Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I'm writing you this letter in German, as although I can speak English fluently, my written English is not eloquent, so I do hope you can get a translator to translate my German for you back into English. It was only recently that upon doing my research of the critter known as Bigfoot that I finally realised what it was that I'd encountered in the summer of 1985 in Alberta, Canada, all those years ago. In Germany, we're not well acquainted with the Bigfoot phenomenon, and I have no knowledge whether such a critter actually exists in our part of the world or not. If they do exist here, I'm not aware of any reported sightings, and if there were physical sightings here, I'm almost certain people would possibly not want to talk about them for fear of ridicule. My name is Zelda, and I'm from Frankfurt in Germany, known for its futuristic skyline and its busy German airport. The city is located on the River Main and is a condensed, thriving metropolis that would possibly feel much like a village to those of you who live in New York. We are home to the famous Frankfurter sausage that is always served with lashings of mustard here in Germany. My story begins when I was working as a young nanny in my early 20s for the wealthy, affluent Fisher family living in the West End, which is equivalent to London's Mayfair or New York's Tribeca district. The Fishers would spend much of their time travelling, as they were an adventurous couple that adored exploring the world, but they were eager to take their children along for the ride as part of their adventure. This invariably meant they required a nanny full-time to take care of the children, while they sauntered out to restaurants, painted the town red, or decided to go skiing for a few days without the kids. I've always loved children, and with the added perk of jetting to other countries around the world and being paid well in the process, it was not a job to be sneezed at by any manner of means, especially back then when overseas travel was far less common and much less accessible than it is today. On a personal level, I could never have afforded to tour so many exciting places, and so working for the Fishers meant I frequented places that were often only visited by the most affluent members of society at the time. So as you can imagine, while the children were young, I journeyed to many parts of the world with the Fisher family. But two stories stand out in all my adventures that border on the bizarre and outlandish, and these are the stories I'm privileged to share with you today. On one occasion we were booked into a fancy, prestigious, opulent hotel in the heart of the English countryside. I so wish I could remember the name of the place, but it was such a long time ago. I do know that it had the quintessential, formidable reputation for being haunted, as many former guests of the hotel had reported hearing disembodied voices, seeing apparitions, and hearing strange laughter, all of which was terribly appealing to the Fishers, as they were the kind of people that just wanted to experience anything and everything. They believed that based on England's vibrant, rich history, staying in a haunted hotel was a terribly exciting prospect. "How do you feel about staying in a haunted hotel for a couple of nights, Zelda?" Millie, my boss, asked me. "It doesn't bother you, does it?" "Of course not," I assured Millie. "It doesn't worry me in the slightest. I don't believe in the paranormal anyway." "That's the spirit," chuckled Millie. "I love how grounded you are, Zelda. Nothing unsettles or unnerves you. I, on the other hand, would be so terrified to see a ghost, but I have to and I want to see one at the very same time, if that makes any sense to you at all." "What does haunted mean, Mummy?" asked Stephen. Millie ruffled her son's hair affectionately with her long fingers. "It just means the hotel we're staying in has a long dynamic history. It's an old building, that's all," she said, giving me a big knowing wink. Before long we settled into this grand historic hotel that was a stunning example of 18th century Queen Anne architecture, and at one time it had been a family mansion. I'd never been an expert of the paranormal before, but I will say this about the hotel. I did sense an outer-worldly energy about this intriguing, curious place, because as you walk down the long corridors past the various hotel suites, you really sensed something was watching you, which even for my pragmatic, very unruffled temperament was slightly discomposing and unsettling. I remember it was surrounded by ubiquitous rolling green turf, geometrical garden designs and beds filled with exquisite English roses. When we booked into the hotel, Millie made a comment to the porter about the so-called paranormal activity reputed to be at the hotel, and made no secret of the fact that we had chosen to stay at this particular hotel in the very hope that we might actually get to spot a ghost. "Have you seen any sightings of the ghost?" she asked in her strong German accent. "I've seen one of the ghosts here, madam," he announced. "A couple of times, actually." He bowed his head and exited the room. He most certainly was not forthcoming, and appeared exceedingly cagey. "That's a bummer," sighed Millie. "If he works here and has only ever seen a ghost on a couple of occasions, what are our chances, I ask you?" That evening, after we retired to bed, I'd been placed in my own suite, which was a lavish hotel room with luxurious designer covers swathing the queen-size bed and large windows overlooking a pretty courtyard. For a long while I read a book, and then I lay down, and before long I had drifted off into a deep sleep. At one stage during the night, I was certain I could hear ethereal music coming from the courtyard, voices and clinking of glasses, almost as if people were having a celebratory party. When I opened the window in my room, everything stopped and became incredibly quiet. It really sent chills down my spine, because the moment I closed the window, the partying seemed to start all over again. If that's not enough weirdness for you, I woke up during the night when I heard an urgent, sharp tapping on my door. It was Stephen standing in the doorway of my bedroom suite. He was trembling and shaking, and his eyes were as wide as saucers. I've never seen the boy look so discomposed and fearful in my entire life. "What on earth is the matter with you?" I asked him, taking him into my arms to comfort him. "You're as white as a sheet. Are you all right?" "I'm frightened," he told me. "A strange woman dressed all funny keeps coming into the room and sits on the bed and stares at me. You've probably just had a nightmare, I told him. Dreams like that can sometimes feel very real. Please will you stay in our bedroom with us, he begged. There's another bed in our room. You can sleep there. All right, I said, putting my arms around Stefan. If it makes you feel better, I'll sleep in the other bed. I hastily put on my dressing gown and followed him to their bedroom suite, which he shared with his brother Gunther. Did you wake Gunther when you got scared? I asked. I tried to, he said, but he's dead to the world and just moaned at me when I tried to shake him. He gets very grumpy if you try to wake him up. As I entered Stefan's bedroom suite, I noted at the end of his bed there appeared to be a deep indentation, almost as if someone had been sitting there, and if that wasn't idiosyncratic and freakish enough, there was a strong floral bouquet, very much like violets. That kind of a scent was permeating the entire room, which I thought was decidedly odd. I could see that Gunther was fast asleep and snoring loudly. I climbed into the spare bed and glanced up at Stefan. Wake me up if you get scared at all. You can call out my name and I'll hear you, I told him. I could tell Stefan was heartily relieved to have me in the bedroom with him. Before long I began to drift off into a deep sleep. And then I was awoken to hear Stefan's voice saying, Zelda, the woman is coming back. It's getting cold in here. It always gets cold when she comes, and the smell of violets gets very strong. I opened my eyes surreptitiously and could feel these blasts of freezing cold icy air entering the room, along with the lingering powerful scent of violet. The only way I can describe it to you is that the room we were sleeping in had become like an icebox. I started to shiver with cold as I was absolutely frozen, and that was when I saw her. I sat up in astonishment, hardly daring to believe what I was discerning, and I was so befuddled that I just stared at this woman. I discerned the woman very clearly, although she seemed slightly blurred and hazy, rather like a photograph that is slightly out of focus. I noticed the details of the blue low-necked gown that she was wearing, that was worn over a pretty petticoat, with the dress open at the front, showing the rest of the petticoat, and I knew that this was a style of clothing from the 1800s. The woman had a young Liz Taylor look about her, with the quintessential dark hair and porcelain-white skin, and was sitting at the end of Stefan's bed, just staring at him with adoring, devoted eyes, and Stefan was staring back at her in absolute terror. I'd never seen him look that afraid. "Excuse me, madam," I said in English. "Do you mind leaving? The boy's trying to get some sleep. He's very tired and would appreciate not being disturbed." The woman's face swiveled around in my direction, and I could feel her eyes fix on me with an angry, hostile glare. And then she just glided out of the room, looking directly at me as she left with eyes like daggers, and if looks could kill, I would almost certainly be dead. I could hear her skirts sweeping across the floor, and she walked right through the closed door and vanished completely from our sight. Stefan was in tears, and I had to console him. "Why was the funny woman staring at me like that?" he cried. "I don't know," I said. As soon as the woman left the room, the coldness receded, and the strong smell of violets eventually faded. I'm relieved to say that she never ever came back again during that night. The following morning I spoke to the concierge and told him about the strange apparition that I'd witnessed during the night, and gave him a detailed description of the woman. "I think you've seen one of our resident ghosts," he informed me. "The lady of the manor, of all things." He pointed to a portrait on the wall of a woman, and I froze at once when I saw the picture, as I recognised her as our mystery visitor. I could hardly believe it. I'd actually seen her ghost. For someone who'd never believed in the paranormal, it completely shifted my perception of reality quite considerably. "She does look a lot like Elizabeth Taylor in her heyday, does she not?" said the gentleman in concierge. "People report the smell of violets when she's around. She was the wife of the original owner of the mansion. She would host hundreds of parties here in former happier days," he said. "They say she haunts the hotel looking for her son." "What happened to her son?" I asked curiously. "Well, I gather he died at the age of 10 from scarlet fever, and the poor woman never came to terms with his tragic death. They said that even after her boy died, she almost lost her mind. She was so torn apart with grief and despair. and simply refused to believe he was actually dead. She would go around the mansion searching for him, calling him out, all day and night looking for him. I gather her husband would tell her that her son was dead, but she simply refused to believe him. It would seem the poor woman had no peace, even in death, as she keeps looking for her son. That's so sad, I said. Do you have a photograph of her son by any chance? I do, as it happens, he said, presenting me with a photograph of a young boy that literally looked identical to Stefan. I was astonished. Is this a joke? I asked, looking at the photograph in absolute disbelief. That was her son, madam. It isn't a joke. I was stumped because the child in the photograph could have been a double for Stefan, and suddenly everything began to make sense, and explained why the woman had actually visited Stefan during the night. She thought he was her son. In that moment I actually felt remarkably sorry for her, roaming around this large mansion, searching for her son, even in death. As you can imagine, I told Stefan not to tell his mother about the ghost we'd seen, because I promise you we would have been forced to stay in that hotel for another night, just because Millie would have wanted to see the ghost for herself, and I'm quite sure she would have visited Stefan during the night. Remind me never to stay at a so-called haunted hotel, said Millie. I think they just say it's haunted just to get extra bookings. No wonder the porter was so indifferent and cagey. He possibly spun us a yarn to get us to believe in a fictitious ghost. Stefan and I exchanged secret glances, for we knew indeed that this hotel was haunted. My next outlandish story happened an entire year later, and that was when the Fisher family went to stay in a large wooden cabin in Alberta, in the Banff area, which is located in Alberta's Rocky Mountains and encompasses majestic mountains, imposing glaciers, ice fields, exquisite turquoise lakes, rivers, scenic valleys, peaks, flowery meadows, dense dreamy coniferous forests, and breathtakingly beautiful alpine landscapes. The opulent wooden cabin where we stayed at Banff was very sizable indeed, with 2 floors with their own balconies, rather reminding me of a grandiose Swiss chalet, as the polished cedar wood just gleamed and sparkled, and there were huge marble fireplaces in every living area in the house, with phenomenal artworks on the walls, and bookshelves simply bursting with books. There were cosy, lavish furnishings, and the most comfortable beds that I've ever slept in, swathed in the finest Egyptian cottons. It was clear that no expense had been spared, but I would not have expected anything less from Millie, because she always enjoyed wallowing in the lap of luxury and enjoying the finer things in life whenever possible. The cabin was literally overlooking the most breathtaking, beautiful scenic views on the lake, fringed by tall, statuesque mountains and dense, dreamy alpine forests, consisting of lodgepole pines and spruce trees that were reflected upon its gleaming silvery surface like a shimmering mirror. I could not have even imagined staying in a more exquisite place than this. After a day or so I was left to mind the children for a few days, as Millie and her husband had decided to go on a 4-day mountainous hike, which involved some exciting camping opportunities that they wanted to enjoy. "We won't be gone for long, Zelda," she said. "Just keep an eye on the kids and don't let them get up to too much mischief." Every day I made sure the children had lots of fun, but I did permit them to go exploring in the woods as long as they didn't stray too far from the cabin. Imagine my surprise when Stefan told me that he'd seen a monkey man in the woods that they'd both been chasing. Based on their description of the critter, I really thought they were talking about a bear, and I nearly lost it with them, I was so cross. "You can't go chasing after bears," I chastised them. "Those creatures can kill humans. What on earth are you thinking?" "No, silly," said Gunther. "I know what a bear is. This was a monkey man. It wasn't a bear." "Whatever," I said. "Don't go chasing monkey men or bears. Do you understand?" But my words must have fallen on deaf ears, because the next day all the kids could talk about was the monkey man. I became increasingly alarmed, because I began to wonder if a man in a monkey suit was grooming the kids. For what I could ascertain, they had chased the monkey man through the woods, and somehow managed to befriend him. How that had happened I couldn't imagine, but the thought made me sick to my stomach, and I could literally taste the nausea rising up in the back of my throat. I was responsible for these kids. If anything bad happened to them, Millie would almost certainly never ever forgive me. We played hide and seek together, Stefan told me, and we went swimming in the river. Monkey Man is very nice. Don't go anywhere near the man, I warned them. You don't know what his intentions are. He might be intending to abduct you. You hear stories about weirdos like that all the time. You need to be careful of strangers. You can't just trust anyone. The next morning, as the kids went out into the woods to play, I guessed they were going to find the Monkey Man. I could tell they were enamoured and fixated by this man, as I noticed the way that their eyes lighted up when they talked about him. That really was a warning sign to me. I assumed that this insidious, duplicitous man was guilefully winning them over as a roue of some kind, and that was very troubling and disconcerting for me. I knew Stefan and Gunther well enough by now to know that they were mischievous most of the time, and not listening to the adults literally went with the territory as far as they were concerned. As young boys, they were naive, vulnerable, and easily misled. I decided I would have words with this nefarious man and tell him to leave the kids alone, or I'd actually call the police. As I walked through the wooded area, I could hear Stefan and Gunther's raised, jubilant voices, and I also heard loud, delighted screams, laughter, cries of delight, whooping sounds, and water splashing, and I realised that they were swimming in the lake. I walked up the hilly incline, and I could see the silhouette of a large figure staring out at the water and watching the children with bent knees through a curtain of shrubbery, with a large, muscular back facing me. My first alarmed thoughts was that this was the shady character that was stalking and spying on the kids. The figure was too hazy for me to see clearly close up, but based on what I could see, the man seemed to be wearing a monkey costume. "Excuse me, sir," I said, walking up to him. The head swiveled around to face me like an owl, and as the head turned, so did the shoulders with it. I realised then that I was not staring at a man, but a colossal ape-like humanoid that was evidently a woman, for she had breasts. I do not know who was more surprised, me or her. I had clearly startled her, for her dismayed large yellow eyes almost looked frightened. I had clearly caught her off guard, and she was not comfortable or at ease with my presence. I remember thinking, why are you frightened of me? I'm the one that should be frightened of you. It would be nothing for you to lash out at me, and I would be dead. Was this creature not even aware of how lofty, majestic, and powerful she was, I wondered. It's hard to give you a sense of perspective as to how enormous this critter was, but she was most certainly Herculean in size. It was a long time ago, so to ascertain how big she was is difficult, so I can only give you estimates. I think she might have been between 7 to 8 foot tall and 600 pounds, and covered in long dark hair, with some blonde highlights in the mix. I do remember that her legs were short and muscular, and her arms exceedingly long. The upper torso, especially the shoulder area, was exceedingly well defined, with pronounced muscle definition, and the head was shaped like a cone, with a little point at the very top, and it seemed to just flow seamlessly into the shoulders. I recall the face was long and feminine, with a skin a dark brown colour, with a defined brow ridge and a very wide but flat nose, with deep-set yellow eyes. I want to tell you that if this critter had not been terrified of me, I think my own fear would have been off the charts. Imagine for a moment standing in the presence of a critter like King Kong. It was like that as far as I was concerned. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was in the presence of an apex predator that demanded respect. Yet the critter's evident fear of me enabled me to let go of all my inhibitions and anxiety, because she wanted to get away from me as fast as she could. I watched her glance at me one more time with very troubled, concerned eyes, and then she vanished from my sight, moving like the wind as she darted away. I pulled the veil of verdant lacy shrubbery right back that overlooked the silvery lake, and that was when I saw Stefan and Gunther splashing around joyfully in the water with a smaller critter that looked like the one I'd encountered moments earlier. That was when I realised that I'd seen the mother watching her youngling playing with human children with a degree of trepidation. I noted that Stefan and Gunther were playing with this little critter as if he was just another kid. It seemed like they were getting along with the humanoid critter famously, and he seemed benign, benevolent, and congenial. It was hard to believe the critter had even been reticent or shy, because in truth he seemed more gregarious and outgoing than the kids themselves. I could see they were throwing Stefan's ball to each other and playing one of those water games, and the strange little critter, who was the splitting image of his mother, kept making these loud, chirpy, whooping sounds. I walked away from the river, feeling confident that the kids were safe and that the hairy humanoid critter that was remarkably human in appearance was warm-hearted and no threat to them. So I allowed the kids to play with the critter, which they did every single day until we left Banff. I naturally advised the kids not to tell their parents about the monkey man they had encountered, and I'm delighted to say they didn't say a thing, but were utterly devastated to say goodbye to their hairy friend, whom they'd grown to love. Stefan gave the critter his ball, and Gunther gave him a box of Lego blocks, and the critter gave them both each a pretty river stone that they still possess all these years later. "I don't want to leave my friend," cried Stefan. "He's different to my friends at home." "In what way?" I asked. "Well, he's so real," said Stefan, "so genuine." After I discovered what the critter was that Stefan and Gunther encountered on their trip to Alberta, I asked them if I could share their account with you, in this anonymous forum, of course, and they were willing to let me share their story. This is what Stefan remembers about the critter. "I gathered the critter I encountered as a young boy was called Bigfoot. Recently I've been reading all kinds of mixed reviews on these creatures. The one I encountered had a heart of gold. I think he was similar in age to both of us, and about 5 foot tall at the time. I never regarded him as an animal ever, but as a human with long hair. Even though he didn't speak our language, that in no way impeded our friendship. While we were staying at the cabin in Alberta, we played with him almost every single day. On the first occasion we saw him, we actually chased after him, and he appeared reticent and desperately shy. He then became inquisitive about us, and we started to throw a ball at him, and the rest is history. That critter, or hairy human, was one of the most genuine friends I've ever had, even if it was only over just a few days that we got to know him. I will never forget him." This is Gunther's account. "Yes, I remember the Bigfoot very well. We called him Monkey Man, because although very human-like, he did have a look of a monkey about him. After the Bigfoot overcame his desperate shyness towards us, he was the most comical, gregarious critter, and he made us both laugh. He did like to mimic us a lot, which was hilariously funny. After a while, I barely noticed our physical differences. He was just like another kid to me, although different to my friends at home. He did not speak German, of course, but the language issue was never a problem. I know I'll never forget our hairy friend. I often wonder if he's still out there, and if he remembers us at all. So there you are. That's my story." Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Laurie, and I'm from Florida, which is located in the southeast quadrant of the United States. My family is from the Hyde Park area of Tampa, Florida, where we grew up in a beautiful bungalow with a large wraparound porch supported by columns and an attractive front and back yard. I've lived here literally all my life with my easygoing, fun-loving parents and my 2 younger sisters. My incredulous story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter did not actually happen here in Florida, as you might have expected, but in the southeast region of the Yellowstone National Park, which is exceedingly remote, with only a scattering of hiking trails, with no clear roads for over 20 miles, and acres of untouched wilderness, undulating valleys, lakes, rivers, and dense thick forest. It's an area of the park where you might not encounter a living soul if you were to need help. And worse still, it is in the heart of grizzly country. It was in the spring of 2005 when I decided to take my girlfriend Annabella to the park for her 21st birthday, as I knew she adored camping, and being naive, ignorant and adventurous, and also eager for a challenge, I thought camping in the middle of nowhere would be a romantic experience for the both of us. Where I got that crazy notion from, I do not know, but that was what I felt at the time. I had visited the park on many occasions before with my family, and we spent many a holiday at Yellowstone National Park, and they had always been memorable and special experiences for us. My parents thought I was crazy to want to take my girlfriend camping to such a remote spot in the park, due to the potential perilous dangers of such a challenging trip. Yet, at 23, life was not exciting without living on the edge somehow, and taking all those precarious risks, and I always fancied myself as somewhat invincible and indestructible. Annabella was so excited and enthused by the trip, and the fact that we would be camping out in a remote part of the park was very exhilarating for her. So armed with my rifle, bear spray, insect repellents, maps, binoculars and compasses, and all the provisions we would invariably need in our backpacks, we proceeded on our way. We hiked along the Snake River and climbed up mountainous ravines with a scattering of logpole pines through verdant undulating valleys, pretty meadows covered in ubiquitous amounts of yellow, blue, white and purple wild flowers, and fields of wild grasses where we saw bison or deer grazing happily. We also encountered the most statuesque waterfalls where white water thundered and roared down the sculptural rocky crevices into the streams below. And then, of course, we loved entering the heavily wooded areas because, like any woodland retreat, it is quite literally a world within a world. I can't describe to you the enchanting, magical beauty of the woods as we trailed through the colourful kaleidoscope of pretty wild flowers under the canopy of the shaded trees, while we enjoyed being serenaded by the joyful songs of the birds. I remember realising just how tiny I was in the huge scheme of things, as the huge size of Yellowstone really made me feel as inconspicuous and indefinite as a little ant. In my own life, I'd always felt so big, important and purposeful, but out here I was dwarfed by the statuesque trees, imposing mountains and endless areas of open space. Annabella and I were having so much fun camping in meadows and woodland areas and on the natural beaches beside meandering streams, and for a long while we never saw a single soul. But that all changed unexpectedly on day 5, when we were setting up camp in the early evening, when out of the blue a random strange man wandered up to our campsite, and I didn't like the look of him at all. "Hi there," he said, seating himself onto the ground outside our tent. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" he said, staring out into space. "Yes, it's lovely," I said, hoping in my heart that this sinister creep would leave us alone. Not to put too fine a point on it, but this guileful-looking man looked like he belonged at home in a prison cell for the criminally insane. There was something nefarious about him that sent icy-cold chills down my spine and caused my hair to stand on end. I noted uneasily that he carried a rifle in the holster around his middle. He was a very strong, lanky man with a very defined, muscular body that suggested he was used to working out for hours on end. No one gets that big without punnelling away for hours, doing laboriously highly disciplined exercise and punishing grueling regimes, lifting heavy weights. The man's arm muscles were so highly exaggerated and his biceps were so large they were like bubbles. For the first time on our trip, I felt more afraid and threatened of this insidious human being than of all the wild animals in the wilderness. This perfidious man had a receding hairline, a long ponytail, a wispy white straggly beard, and a large, ugly, jagged scar along his cheeks, and his narrow, deep-set, slitted eyes looked rather like that of a bull terrier's. Most of his arms and chest were covered in inky tattoos of snakes and dragons, and the man smelt putrid like stale urine and sweat, as if he hadn't bathed in days. If that wasn't bad enough, he kept glancing at my girlfriend with an amorous glint in his eyes, which I found exceedingly discomposing and unsettling. "How long have you been out here?" I asked in a nonchalant way, eyeing him wearily. "Long enough," he said. "Are you on holiday here?" I asked. "In a manner of speaking," he said. I realised I wasn't going to get any answers from him because the man was evasive and didn't want to answer my questions. I decided not to extend him the courtesy of offering him any coffee because I wanted him to leave, but he long outstayed his welcome, barely saying a single word to us, but just sitting there awkwardly and fiddling with the rifle in his holster all the time, almost as if he was thinking of using it on us, and so I was in a heightened sense of awareness as I studied his every move. Finally he said, "See you in the morning. Enjoy your evening." Annabella and I knew that the very last thing we ever wanted was to see that man ever again. "What a creep," said Annabella, looking at me with wide eyes. "I feel him undressing me all the time with those eyes of his. It's very scary." "There's something wrong with him," I agreed. "I thought we'd never get rid of him. If I didn't know any better, I would say he'd escaped from a loony bin. There's something not right about him." "What on earth shall we do?" asked Annabella. "We need to move away from here at first light," I said, "and take another route far away from here. We don't want that creep hanging around us. There's something odd about him." And so it was, before the sun had even risen over the horizon, Annabella and I, wearing our headlamps, quickly retreated from our camping area, hoping with all our hearts we could lose that weirdo, and it seemed that we had been successful. During the late afternoon, we found the quintessential perfect camping spot. It was on the side of a mountainous ridge, flanked by a thick forest on the rear side, and overlooking a little stream that jutted over the sculptural boulders, and was surrounded by its own natural sandy beach, dotted with some sizable, voluptuously shaped boulders, all works of art in their own right. As our tent was a dirty brown colour, it was perfectly camouflaged, and Annabella believed if we set it up against the ridge that the tent would not be visible to the snooping weirdo that we had encountered the previous night. We hoped if he went on the prowl looking for us that he would not find us in the vast expanse of the park, because we could be anywhere. We knew that camped against the ridge our tent might look like part of the mountainous outcrop and would barely be even noticed. That evening I prepared the fire pit, boiling some water for our freeze-dried meals. We drank hot cups of tea and ate plates of chicken and rice, while we sat back and watched the resplendent folds of the tangerine golds of the sun setting across the valley. When dusk rolled across the sky and deepened in intensity, a new night was born. We both marvelled at the magnificent kaleidoscope of silvery stars that sparkled across the vast firmament like glittering diamonds, and we noted with delight that there was a full moon that provided a natural bright light for the night that lay ahead. "Thank goodness that ghastly creep isn't around," sighed Annabella happily. "It's so beautiful out here, just the two of us. I wouldn't want anything to ruin it for us." That evening we retired to our sleeping bags earlier than usual, as we had fatigued ourselves and were overcome with exhaustion after the long day of arduous physical exertion and heavy trekking through the wilderness from the crack of dawn. So I was awoken during the night by the sound of a heavy wind blowing vigorously against our tent and beating, punnelling and walloping the canvas. I realised with relief that we were lucky to be parked against the mountainous ridge, as it offered a perfect windbreak for us. Moments later I could distinctly hear the ominous sound of heavy feet moving towards our tent, while the wind was wailing, moaning and whistling loudly. My first terrified thought was that the creep we'd encountered the previous afternoon had finally found us. I could feel my heart thumping violently in my chest and the nausea rising up in the back of my throat. I felt sick to my stomach. If the man had gone to all this trouble to seek us out, I was certain he was a killer on the loose. I hadn't forgotten the way he'd fiddled with his gun the previous afternoon. I shook Annabella awake vigorously. "Hear that?" I whispered earnestly. "I think that creep has found our camping spot. I can hear his feet crunching the pebbles outside our tent. I can sense he's up to no good." Annabella was absolutely terrified. Her face was as white as a sheet, and her eyes grew as round as saucers, and she began to visibly shake like a jelly. "Why is he stalking us like this?" she wailed. "He wants to hurt us. I know he does." "Calm down," I said, reaching for my rifle. "If I have to shoot him dead, that is what I'm going to do." All of a sudden we found our tent being hit with an avalanche of pebbles, and we could hear the most terrifying screams that were to date the most horrifying sounds that I've ever heard in my entire life, with a tonal capacity that literally reverberated through my chest. It sounded like several women were being murdered all at once, only yards outside our tent, and I wondered in horror if we would be next. "What the heck is happening?" cried Annabella in alarm. "Someone is being murdered, and our tent is being violently attacked. We could be next." In that moment it was as if time stood still, as everything unfolding before us was what my most darkest, traumatic nightmares are made of. I really believed a woman had just been murdered, and everything was so surreal that I was completely benumbed. I couldn't feel anything. I think, in my incapacitating fear, I was unable to think clearly, as even my thoughts were handicapped and disabled. I could hear the sound of very heavy feet thundering across the granular beach. If this wasn't bad enough, our tent was being deliberately smacked, clobbered and battered by something or someone, and these intentional attacks on the canvas of our tent was not from the heavy wind. I knew we were under attack, and so I grabbed my rifle and unzipped the tent, summing up all the internal courage that I could muster. I peered through the zipper very cautiously and could see the hazy, blurred silhouettes of 3 dark, shadowy forms in the moonlight. I knew at once what I was observing, and I let out the most horrified gasp. I was so astonished by what I was beholding. "What is it?" cried Annabella. "What do you see?" "We're being attacked by 3 Bigfoot," I told her. "They're absolutely massive and covered with long dark hair, and they look as mean as hell." "Oh my goodness, what shall we do?" she cried. "Let me think," I said, cocking my rifle. Suddenly we heard roars and screams that sent chills down my spine as we could feel our tent being smacked and tugged. "We need to get out of here now," I screamed at Annabella. "The Bigfoots are tugging and clobbering our tent." "Get out!" I screamed. We both ran out of our tents as fast as we possibly could, only to find ourselves surrounded and hemmed in by 4 hefty, burly Bigfoots. It was like they were surrounding us on every side, disabling us from being able to escape. I was trembling and shaking so much, and fumbling away with my rifle, wondering whether I should risk shooting one of the Bigfoots or not. I knew that might be a reckless decision to make, as there was only 2 of us against 4 of these powerful critters. If these Bigfoot were intent on killing us, I might as well put up a fight, as what did I have to lose if we were dead anyway, I thought. It was too late to ponder upon this very thought, for one of the Bigfoot seemed to almost read my thoughts and hastily grabbed my rifle from me, throwing it across the sandy beach, far from my reach. The Bigfoots were so close to us that we could hear their heavy horse-like breathing and feel their warm apple-smelling breath on our bodies. I was certain we were going to be torn limb from limb and eaten by these creatures. What were they waiting for? Surely they were not going to prolong the agony of their prey, I wondered. If they were going to kill us, why were they holding us hostage like this, I wondered. The irony is that when we were crowded in by these Bigfoots, they suddenly became calm, and their former aggression subsided. I could see one of the Bigfoots finally leave our circle and begin to tug at our tent and drag it across the beach sand, along with all its contents still inside, and our 2 large backpacks. What on earth were they doing, I wondered. Annabella was crying and begging the Bigfoots not to kill us. "Please, please don't kill us, please." I looked at one of the Bigfoots straight in his eyes, expecting to see hatred and animosity within their depths, but it was like I was staring in the eyes of a loving, caring and nurturing father. It was then that I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that these critters were not going to harm us at all. Yet if that was the case, why on earth were they imprisoning us like this and holding us hostage? As the howling wind increased in intensity, all of a sudden there was an almighty, thunderous, calamitous crash, and then in a trice the whole ridge just collapsed and subsided, and some of the large boulders went rolling down the countryside, and the dirt rose up to the ground like the smoke from an explosion. After this catastrophic, potentially deadly event was when the 4 Bigfoot suddenly glided away, leaving us standing there, alone in a stunned stupor, hardly daring to believe what had just transpired. I grabbed Annabella in my arms, and we held each other and sobbed with relief and joy. We were still alive. I realized that the Bigfoots had actually saved our lives and our tents. They had no intention of harming us at all. They wanted to protect us from the rock slide. It would seem they had deliberately terrified us out of our tents. If we'd been in our tents when the ridge came down, we would almost certainly be dead. This was a very sobering thought for the both of us to comprehend. We had narrowly escaped death. Falsely we had believed that the Bigfoots were our danger, but it was nature herself who was moments away from demanding our lives from us, because believe me when I say this, we would have almost certainly have been killed in an unsurvivable event, for the sheer weight of the ridge would have crushed us to death without a shadow of a doubt. "I just don't understand how those Bigfoots knew that that mountainous ridge was going to collapse," said Annabella in amazement. "I just don't get how they could possibly know." Well, maybe they have a greater understanding of the natural world than we do, I suggested. Maybe they sense things and feel vibrations. I thought Bigfoots were supposed to be mean and dangerous and volatile, said Annabella. Well, clearly not all of them are like that, I said, as we've seen for ourselves tonight. The wind continued to beat and pummel us, so I quickly grabbed our tent and we hitched it on the far side of the sandy beach. I was ever so grateful that it was still intact, as the rock side would almost certainly have made it impossible to retrieve. The area now looked like a demolition site, with rocks absolutely everywhere piled on top of each other in a huge chaotic heap. After our terrifying scare, Annabella and I chose to leave the park and return home forthwith. My father falsely assumed that we could not hack camping out in the remote wilderness, but he was wrong about that. "You see, I told you," he chided. "It's not safe camping out in the wild with grizzlies loitering around." We never told my parents, nor anyone else for that matter, what had happened to us. If we found our experience with Bigfoot so daunting, implausible and surreal, how on earth could we expect anyone else to comprehend or believe what we'd been through? So we kept our narrow escape with death a big secret. I'm sure you'd like me to recount what the Bigfoots we encountered actually looked like, and I will do my level best to do so. I would say they ranged between the heights of 7 to 10 foot tall, and from 500 to 900 pounds. They possessed dark, long flowing hair, but as to the exact tone of colour, I can't be sure. The creatures had very distinct cone-shaped heads, were huge in size and girth, but they didn't smell rank at all. In fact, I'd say their breath smelt rather of apples. Fast forward a week or so, and I was watching America's Most Wanted on television. I remember the presenter clearly saying, "On America's Most Wanted tonight, we're looking for Nicholas, who was last seen shopping at Walmart in downtown Montana. He is armed and dangerous and is wanted for the brutal murder and violent assault of his girlfriend Alice and 3 other young women in their early 20s. He is described as very unkempt, with a white straggly beard, receding hairline, long mousy ponytail, deep-set small blue eyes, and a very prominent jagged scar on his cheek. He is exceedingly well built with a bodybuilder's physique. If you know where he is, please phone the hotline as soon as possible." I phoned the police immediately and told them about my strange, bizarre encounter with the man, and from what I learnt from the police, Annabella and I were lucky indeed to be alive. I was informed that our sighting of Nicholas led to his arrest, as he was found living on a campsite at Yellowstone, in the remote part. All these years later, I'm now happily married with my wife Liz and my 3 kids, living in Tampa, Florida. Annabella and I see each other in passing from time to time, and are still good friends. She gave me permission to share our story in this anonymous forum with you and your listeners. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Francesca, and I'm from Waynesville in Haywood County, which is the largest town in North Carolina, 30 miles west of Asheville, between the Grey Smoky and the Blue Ridge Mountains. I've lived in this exquisite part of the world all my life, and the pretty town procures a great deal of annual income from the tourism industry, as visitors come from far and wide, from all over the world, to visit places like the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, or Magpie Valley, which is home to great skiing opportunities. And there are, of course, so many other exciting places of interest here. There's so much to do in this part of the world, from fishing, skiing, hiking, mountain climbing, horse riding, and the list goes on. And I personally would not want to live anywhere else in the world if I had a choice. It was in the spring of 2006 when I was living with my husband and my young son Jonathan in our idyllic little beautiful vernacular-style mountain retreat, overlooking exquisite panoramic views over the mountains from every single room in our home. I mean, it didn't get better than that. My bizarre, extraordinary story begins when my husband died tragically in a motorbike accident, when he was violently flung off his bike and killed on impact, despite the fact that he was actually wearing his helmet at the time. I'll never forget the day when a police officer arrived at my door to reveal to me the most shattering news that literally tore my world apart in a matter of seconds, limb from limb. I was never quite the same after that harrowing revelation, but I've learnt to come to terms with his death.
At that stage of my life, I was in my early 20s with a 6-year-old boy to raise up all on my own. And losing my husband was a devastating blow for the both of us. In truth, I would have fallen apart if it hadn't been for my son, Jonathan. When you have a young kid to raise, you have to take the bull by the horns and get on with your life. You can't afford to mope or feel sorry for yourself. In those days, my husband had not taken out any life insurance policies because when you're that young, you have other expenses to worry about, and the last thing you ever envisage is dealing with a sudden tragic death. So now I had very serious practical considerations to concern myself with. How was I going to make any money with no real skills behind me? I wanted to be there for my son when he was growing up as a stay-at-home mum. I was feeling so afraid, vulnerable and insecure, but I knew I had to be brave for my son. I urgently needed to find a way to usher in an income or to face the very grim possibility of losing everything I ever had. One of the wisest, astute and shrewdest decisions I ever made was to ask my best friend Jenny to take up board and lodgings with me, as she lived on her own and rented an apartment from a less than agreeable landlord who was very happy to see the back of her, as there was no love lost between them. I knew with her wholesome, honourable and uplifting presence in our home during the evenings, she would keep a watchful eye on my son and be a tonic for him, and her financial contribution was invaluable for me. But it was still not enough income for me to meet my financial monthly demands, and so I needed another source of income to cover the shortfall. "I'll have to work at night," I told Jenny. "I could do office cleaning or work in a bar or restaurant. What do you think about that?" "I think you should do ghost tours," joked Jenny. "That's infinitely more interesting." "You are kidding me, aren't you?" I asked. "I don't know the first thing about ghosts, nor do I actually even believe in them." "I was actually joking," said Jenny. "But thinking about it, I don't think it's a bad idea. You know an awful lot about Waynesville and Asheville's history, and you have a van that can seat over 10 people. Surely it's got to beat office cleaning and restaurant work any time. You might even have fun in the process. What's the harm in giving it a shot?" "I'll think about it," I said. But those were my last words. It would seem that this alternative, unconventional, somewhat novel idea started to take off in my head rather like a rocket on a launch pad. The more I thought about it, the more appealing the proposition seemed. Waynesville and Asheville, I'm delighted to say, are both places with a long, compelling, haunted history behind them, alongside some arresting, provocative legends of note. Better still, at that time, there was a growing, hearty interest in the paranormal. So I dived into the deep end and offered small ghost tours for visitors frequenting the area by taking them in my van on nighttime excursions to visit graveyards, forests, and places long since reputed to being haunted. In a trice, I embarked on this strange, epigrammatic, abnormal adventure. In reality, this preposterous idea was way out of my comfort zone, because I didn't have any real knowledge or solid interest or background in the paranormal, nor did I have any real belief that ghosts actually existed. I can assure you, when it comes to making a quick easy buck or $1 or two, you'll do almost anything, well, almost anything, to keep a roof over your child's head. And this job was better than most. And the very best part of the job was that I ran the show and I was my own boss, so I wasn't answerable to anyone, which was exceedingly appealing to me. So began my strange adventure into the uncharted, turbulent, tumultuous waters of the paranormal. Before long I was being booked regularly for ghost excursions and even being recommended. I never looked back after that. The broad range of people I met came from all walks of life and all parts of the world, and they all had one thing in common, an ardent passion and fascination for things that go bump in the night. As one of my visitors impassionately articulated, once you've seen a ghost, your whole view of reality shifts, and you want to explore the mystery further and investigate other areas into the paranormal, in the vain hope you might have another random ghostly encounter. It would seem that many of my visitors had in some way been exposed to some kind of weird, outlandish, arousing experience in their lives that had sparked a fascination for the paranormal that simply could not be quashed. I had one client who told me that his keenness in the paranormal was sparked and provoked in Gettysburg when he witnessed several Civil War soldiers marching at the National Cemetery he visited. He had seen them in the distance, marching in the late afternoon, and he thought it was some kind of very impressive realistic reenactment being done by actors. I was so impressed with how professional they looked, he told me. They made me feel like I was stepping back in time. I continued to stare at them, and they seemed so vividly real. All of a sudden, to my amazement, they began to fade in front of my very eyes, until they all but disappeared altogether. Then it hit me like a ton of bricks in the head that I'd seen a reenactment of real soldiers at the battle in Gettysburg. I was to learn that many others like myself had seen fleeting sightings of these ghostly apparitions of soldiers on several occasions, and I was not alone in my bizarre experience, but it fired up my passion for the paranormal. Wow, I said, that's quite some story. As you can imagine, while I was meeting so many interesting people, I must confess that I was beginning to enjoy my job, as peculiar as that sounds. It was helping me to heal my broken heart, because instead of wallowing in my desperate pain and grief, I was quite literally able to embrace my life. One evening when my visitors were eating dinner in the haunted hotel we visited in Asheville, I surreptitiously excused myself from the table to make a hasty retreat to the ladies' room to reapply my lipstick and refresh myself. It was eerily quiet in the ladies' room, unsettlingly so, I might add, without a single soul in sight. It felt oddly chilling and haunting, almost as if I was standing in a refrigeration unit. That's how cold it was. The ladies' room was very opulent and stylish, with large gold ornate mirrors, luxurious decorative floor carpeting, and elaborate baroque dressing tables, with upholstered embellished chairs, and a very discreet area for the toilet cubicles. As I was applying my lipstick in the mirror, I heard a toilet flush, and then I saw a young female face staring at me in the mirror. "Hello there," I said, turning around to look directly at the woman that I'd seen, who I assumed had just been to the toilet, but imagine my surprise when no one was standing there, nor had anyone left the room. I shrugged my shoulders and then continued applying my lipstick again, and then I saw the face staring at me again through the mirror for only a fleeting second. It was so quick, but enough time for me to discern that the woman was definitely young, between 18 to 22 years old. I turned around to examine the immediate area, and once again no one was there. I watched in horror as the faucet in the sink next to me turned on and off, all on its own accord, as if someone invisible was washing their hands next to me. Then I heard a woman's footsteps walking towards the powder room door, which opened and closed on its own accord, just as it would have done if a real person had visited the ladies and was leaving. By this time my hair was standing on edge, my heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I kept thinking to myself, did I really just see that? I took out my lipstick and wrote on the mirror in a nonchalant way, why I did this I don't know, "Who are you?" And then my lipstick tumbled out of my hands for a moment. I thought it was me being clumsy, but now I'm not so sure. I was looking all over the carpet, crawling on my hands and knees to try and relocate my lipstick, wondering where it had fallen. I couldn't see it on the floor, so I scanned the sink area, and sure enough, my lipstick was lying there in the sink. I packed it away in my handbag and glanced briefly into the mirror one more time to examine my reflection. And not only did I briefly get a second glance of the female face that I'd previously seen, that faded in an instant, but imagine my immense shock and horror when there, in strange curly writing, in my very same red lipstick, were the words Helen. It was a direct answer to my question, and it freaked me out. Believe me, I bolted out of that bathroom as fast as I could, and for a long time I could not fathom what had happened, and told no one about the strange outer-worldly experience, although I was to discover that Helen was indeed one of the ghosts reputed to haunt that hotel. I was to learn that Helen apparently was travelling from summer break from NYU and was viciously murdered, and her uncle was the unfortunate one to have found her deceased body. It is believed that Helen wanders around the Battery Park Hotel in Asheville trying to look for answers to her death. I believe I am one of the many people who has encountered her ghost, but who would have imagined it possible to encounter her in the toilet cubicle of all places? Most of my ghost tours, as is usually the case with any ghost tour, is uneventful in terms of ghostly experiences or paranormal activity. But regardless of this fact, everybody is always in an energized, positive, upbeat mood, and always ever hopeful that this might be the one occasion when something ghostly happens. But as is always the case, there are no guarantees at all. On this occasion, I was visiting a cemetery with my overseas visitors. Believe me, there was something quite exciting about visiting a cemetery at the dead of night. Some of my guests claimed to have had photographs with all kinds of light orbs that were not discernible to the human eye. And I've been shown many of these pictures myself, and frankly, I don't know quite what to make of them, because they are bizarre. Before I embark on telling you about my next story, I need to tell you a little about Boojum, which is part of the Haywood County legend, for it is very significant in regards to the story I am about to tell you. The legend took root and bore leaves and ultimately blossomed in the 1900s, and many believed is birthed from dozens of personal real-life encounters and experiential reports that people had in those bygone days with a critter fitting the distinct profile and definition of a Bigfoot, or the abominable snowman if you prefer, or even the Yeti. The critter the people encountered in those past days was described as half man and half beast, with long shaggy grey hair, who was about 8 feet tall, with a very distinctive human-like face. According to these legends, the critter lived in many different caves, hidden within the crevices and crags of the Balsam Mountains, which is a range of mountains that joins the Blue Ridge Mountains in southwest Haywood County. It was believed that in those foregone days, Boojum had two quintessential great loves. The former was pretty young women, while the latter glittering, dazzling gemstones that can be found in North Carolina, from garnet to moonstone, rose quartz, ruby, sapphire, topaz, emerald, and the list goes on. It would seem that Balsam delighted in beauty of every kind, for it was said he marvelled at the beauty of panoramic views of the Balsam Mountains and the changings of the seasons, and delighted most particularly in the rich red golds of autumn and the carpets of white snow that veiled the landscape in winter. For indeed, to confirm Boojum's great love of all things incredibly beautiful, it was purported that he possessed a vast, extraordinary selection of the most exquisite gemstones that you've ever seen in your life. He hid these in various caves. It was understood that Boojum placed these precious gems at the bottom of sealed large jugs, which he filled with a very potent moonshine, of which a couple of sips would knock you for 6 and render you highly intoxicated. Many a gem seeker went searching for Boojum's treasure, but on coming upon it, they would be tempted to at least take a couple of sips of this potent cocktail, of which they would pass out almost immediately, and henceforth fall into a deep trance-like sleep, only to awaken with one hell of a splitting headache. They would discover that Boojum had surreptitiously retrieved all his gems while they'd been passed out. In the 1900s, many young girls would bathe in the stream to save money on the cost of a regular bath. Boojum was alleged to be a little bit of a peeping Tom, so he would hide behind the rhododendron bushes or clandestinely use the mountain laurels for camouflage and would surreptitiously watch the woman bathe. If the woman saw Boojum spying on them, they were filled with absolute terror and would grab their stuff and run away screaming at the top of their lungs. One woman, however, called Annie, was completely different. She reacted incredibly differently when she saw Boojum watching her bathing. She fell in love with the critter and his deep, soulful, sad eyes. Before long, Annie left her life behind to live with Boojum in the mountains, much to the dismay of her family, who could not understand or comprehend her love for the big shaggy creature. Boojum was deeply in love with Annie, yet the lure of glittering gems was too hard for him to resist, and he would leave her alone for long periods of time in search for more treasure. Many wondered whether Annie and Boojum actually had children, and if their descendants are roaming around the Balsam Mountains, as many have reported sightings of grey shaggy Bigfoots. So now that I've given you a summary of this legend, let me tell you my incredulous story. It was on a Friday night in early spring in 2007 when we were visiting a graveyard in Haywood County. On this occasion I had 10 visitors with me, all wearing headlamps, and all with one thing in common. They were hoping to have some kind of a ghostly experience. Some of my clients had dowsing rods with them, tape recorders and cameras, and we all just went on our walks across the graveyard, breaking up into groups of 2. Many of my visitors enjoyed reading the gravestones and exploring the cemetery on their own, so we all agreed to meet back at my car at 12:30. I was teamed up with a young man called Eddie, who was from Edinburgh in Scotland. He told me he fancied a brief walk in the wooded area, consisting of tall statuesque pine trees. Eddie emphatically believed that this was a good place to encounter ghostly phenomenon, and reluctantly I agreed. So we walked together into the heart of the Sylvan, and I could smell the uplifting aroma and smell of pine needles. I suddenly got the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. It was such a disturbing, creepy, uneasy feeling that sent shivers down my spine and caused the hair on my head to stand up on edge. I could see Eddie was feeling it too, because his discomposed face had grown as white as a sheet, and he looked incredibly spooked. "Something is watching us," he said. "I can feel it." "Maybe we should leave," I said, hurriedly hoping with all my heart that he would agree. "Are you kidding?" said Eddie. "This is exactly why we're here." Reluctantly I agreed to follow him into the pine woods, and every time we walked forward we could hear the rustling leaves being crunched behind us. I could sense we were definitely being followed, because when we stopped, so did the footsteps. For a moment I did wonder if one member of our group was having a laugh at our expense by trying to scare us. It had happened to me before on multiple occasions when some of my guests had scared me half to death, just as a joke, especially because I conveyed that I didn't believe in ghosts. "All right," I said, turning around. "Game over. This isn't funny. I know you're there. Show yourself." There was no answer, and all I could hear was the sound of my breath and Eddie's. Even the natural sound of crickets and frogs seemed suspended in time, because we never heard a thing. It was like the forest took on a menacing ambience all of its own. I want to assure you that when something is deadly quiet, something is most certainly up. Then I saw it lying on the path ahead of us. It was one of the girls' hats. It belonged to the fashionable, glamorous Celia from France, who was on our team. And this was no ordinary hat, as Celia was a fashion designer. Her hat was so gorgeous, it was covered in bright, glitzy, sparkling fake gemstones, from reds to greens to turquoises and all kinds of magnificent colours. Everyone was in awe of that hat, and everybody wanted it, because it was so incredibly eye-catching and bedazzling, and the stones just literally glittered and sparkled like real gems. I had found myself staring at her gorgeous hat all evening at the hotel as we were eating dinner. That's how stunning it was. Celia's now sparkling hat was lying in the middle of the path. What on earth was it doing there? Now I was absolutely convinced that Eddie and I had been set up by a couple of members of the group, including Celia, eager to scare us, and Celia had accidentally dropped her hat and given the game away. "Celia," I shouted, retrieving the hat, "you've given yourself away, I'm afraid. I've got your hat, so stop playing games now. Eddie and I know that you're there." "I see you," Celia shouted Eddie suddenly, running towards a tall pine tree on the left, where he believed he had discerned a quick movement. And that was when we saw him. I was now in complete and utter shock, as standing before us was Bigfoot. This was no joke. He was about 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, covered in long shaggy grey hair, with a face that was so uncannily human, with deep-set green eyes, a flat nose and a thin mouth. He was so colossal that I almost passed out from absolute shock. I've never been so terrified in my entire life, but for some reason I could not run away. I wanted to run, but I just could not. I froze to the spot, staring at this critter for what seemed like hours on end, when in reality it was possibly only seconds. But it's amazing how time stands still when you're overwhelmed by a paralysing, discomposing fear. The Bigfoot lunged towards me, and truly I thought my life was over. I thought I was being attacked because the Bigfoot was so intimidating, so powerful, and so huge. I let out the most god-awful scream that I didn't even know I was capable of making, and the critter snatched the hat I was holding and darted away, moving like greased lightning back into the heart of the forest. I turned around to look at Eddie, and he was freaking out. "What the heck was that?" he said, trembling. He was shaking so much, I was not sure quite how to calm him down. "Did you see the size of that thing?" said Eddie. "I thought he was going to kill us, but I couldn't run away. Where the hell did my adrenaline get to? It's supposed to help you in life and death scenarios, but mine just chose to freeze up. My body's always let me down when I needed it the most," he piped. All of a sudden we heard running feet as several members on my team rushed into the woods, sounding frantic. "We heard your scream," said Celia. "What happened? Did you see a ghost?" "No, nothing like that," said Eddie. "You will never believe what happened to us," said Celia, bursting with excitement. "A ghost stole my hat in the middle of the cemetery. And you saw it, didn't you, Carol?" "Well, yes, I saw it briefly. It was a ghostly, shadowy figure, very huge, floating through the cemetery, carrying Celia's hat with very, very long arms. This thing was built like a giant. It scared the living daylights out of me. It almost looked demonic, but it was a ghost. It must have been. Nothing can float like that." "Can you believe it?" said Celia. "Even ghosts are attracted to my hat, but I never ever felt it being lifted off my head." "Wow," said Eddie. "That's amazing." Eddie and I wisely decided not to tell Celia that it was a Bigfoot that stole her hat, because she was incredibly excited that something paranormal had happened to her, so much so that she had almost forgotten the value of her hat. So I didn't have the heart to tell her that there was a worldly explanation for her missing hat, although it was an outer-worldly creature that had indeed stolen it from her. It was only when I returned home that I began to think about the legend of Boojum. Then I began to connect the dots, as the Bigfoot I encountered had grey hair and a shaggy coat with a very distinctive human-like face, just like the descriptions of Boojum. The thing that really got me thinking is that the Bigfoot-like creature stole a hat that was covered with fake-looking gemstones. It would seem that one of Boojum's descendants has also got a keen eye for something sparkly. This is what I believed happened at the cemetery. I believe Celia and her friend Carol were examining gravestones together in the cemetery and chatting away happily, blindly oblivious that they were being stalked by a Bigfoot. For indeed this critter was probably bedazzled and beguiled by Celia's glitzy hat, and was intent on stealing it. So with thrift cunning and great speed, it grabbed Celia's hat and ran into the forest, but accidentally dropped her hat in haste to get away. All of a sudden he realised he dropped the precious hat, and subsequently retraced his steps looking for it. That was when Eddie and I entered the Sylvan, and I recovered Celia's hat lying there on the path that the Bigfoot had accidentally dropped. Eddie detected a movement behind the tree, and then we saw the critter, who made a beeline for me, grabbing the hat out of my hands, and then running away. So if anybody is wondering if the legend of Boojum is true, I'm convinced and here to tell you that it is, because there are too many coincidences to overlook the obvious. I noticed that the critter had grey shaggy hair like Boojum, the human-like face, the green eyes that probably come from Annie's side. The critter also had an ardent passion for shiny gems, just like Boojum. I'm in no doubt that we would have never encountered this critter if it had not been for Celia's glitzy hat. All this leaves me wondering if Annie and Boojum's descendants are indeed frequenting the areas around Haywood County, still searching for precious gems. So make sure that if you come into our part of the world that you're not wearing something too dazzling, because a descendant of Boojum might just steal it from you. Naturally, I've had all manner of encounters on my ghost hunts with my visitors, and now I'm a staunch believer. There's also the story of a woman called Helen who hung herself on Helen's Bridge as her daughter was killed in a fire, and she was overcome with the most discomposing grief. Imagine my surprise when I parked my van close to Helen's Bridge with all my ghost team in the back of the van. Suddenly there was an urgent tapping at my window, and I immediately wound it down. 2 women were standing there, but there was something about them that gave me the chills. One of the women told me that her child was missing, and had I seen her wandering around. Everyone in the van said, "No, sorry, we haven't seen anyone." The woman thanked me and started to walk away. "Hold on," said one of my visitors in the back of the van. "The ghost of Helen is supposed to wander around this area asking people if they've seen her lost child. Maybe she has a ghostly companion now. Another ghost, perhaps." Everyone immediately jumped out of the car to see if we could spot the 2 women. And there they were, standing at another car, talking to its occupants, probably asking them exactly what they'd asked us earlier. We stood a short distance away watching, and once the 2 women started to walk away from the car, they both faded and dissipated before our eyes. Everyone was so excited because we knew we had seen Helen's ghost. It seems she's now teamed up with another ghost to help her on her hunt for her child. All these years later, I'm remarried to a client I actually met on one of my ghost tours, and we now have 3 children all of our own. One from my previous marriage, of course. I no longer work as a guide for ghost tours, but I have become an accomplished cook, so that I do have a skill I can always rely upon in troubled times. For anyone going through a loss of any kind, I want to assure you that there is light at the end of the tunnel. In my experience, the pain never goes away, but it does get easier, and despite everything, life can be incredibly beautiful. So even on the darker days, always remember that this too will pass. Never ever forget that. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. I truly think that the descendants of Boojum are out there, because we do hear of Bigfoots that are incredibly human-like, and Bigfoots with green eyes, and perhaps they're Annie's descendants.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.